Can you see this? Yes. Okay. I'm going to assume yes. Hello, my name is Divya Sasidaran, and I am a Vue developer. I'm currently one second, sorry. I'm currently a developer advocate at Netlify, and if you're interested in everything that Netlify does, in short, we allow you to make it easy for a Git-based static site deployment. And if you're interested to learning more, you can find me online. I'm shortdiv, and shortdiv pretty much everywhere on GitHub and so on. And so I'm going to start my talk. I've actually given this talk at a version of this talk at VueConf earlier this year, which talked about my transition from React to Vue, because I was a React developer for a long time and transitioned to Vue about a year ago. But since I gave that talk in March, a lot has changed. For one, React has changed their API to React 16, which introduced a lot of interesting and awesome concepts. Thankfully, a lot of the things that we talk about in this talk are still relevant today, and so you don't have to worry about that. The other thing that happened is that Vue has officially surpassed React in terms of GitHub stars, which is awesome, but it's almost as meaningless as saying 2 + 2 is 4 minus 1 is 3. It's almost as meaningless as quick maths. And so with that, I just wanted to go over like my transition from React to Vue, which was actually which was a pretty bumpy road. And if anyone has learned a new framework, you're familiar with this, where you're just kind of bumbling along, trying to figure out how things are happening. My transition was, I started out like most people, you start from learning the basics and then you work from there. But I was a bit frustrated with this because as a React developer, I was very competent. And in Vue, I wasn't as competent. I couldn't translate a lot of the advanced concepts I was familiar with, which was really frustrating. And so I decided to, instead of taking a step-by-step approach, I decided to just hack everything, make Vue work to the way that I want it to be. So write Vue like how someone would write React, and then take a step back and reevaluate my process to make it more Vue-like. And so with this, I have structured this talk in mind. And we're going to go through various concepts which translate between the two frameworks. So we have the first concept, which is render components. Then we'll go on to talk about rendering children. Then we'll talk about render props. And lastly, which is my favorite part of this talk, we'll talk about renderless components. So to begin, componentization is a foundational concept of front-end development. You can't really build a web app without thinking about the constituent layers and pieces that go into that specific app. So Stephen Hay has a really great quote that explains this, where he talks about how as developers and designers, we often implement and design in terms of concepts, even though we think in the large picture in terms of the overall page or the web app. And so in my talk at VueConf, I actually used an analogy. I really enjoy using analogies when I go through a talk. And so I used a cup of tea, but I figured that I'll localize the talk a little bit to make it more appropriate for this audience. And so I'm going to use jollof rice. I have good Nigerian and Ghanaian friends, and they mentioned that jollof is very popular here. And so with jollof rice, it's a one-pot dish. So it's kind of all, it's similar to fried rice. There's just everything in it, or at least that's my understanding of it. But jollof rice can be broken down into its constituent layers. It's a bit simplified, but bear with me here. You have the rice, and then you have like the vegetable or the meat layer. In this case, I'm going to use vegetables. Then you have the stew, and then you have the water layer. And so if you were to represent that in terms of components, you could pretty much think of them as like rice and veggies and stew and water and so on. And in React, to represent this, you could use a class. And you would instantiate that class with props. And then in the render function, you could return a single div with an ID of rice, because this is specifically that layer. And then you can copy this for the other layers as well. And in Vue, we start to see the differences between the two, because in React, it's everything within a JavaScript file. And in Vue, we start to pull apart the layers. So we have the template, and then we have the script tag. And in the template, you write your div, which is the ID of rice. And then in the script tag, you have this export function where you name the specific component and you can add the constituent layers and the constituent logic that goes with that layer. And so with jollof rice, I'm going to speak from my experience making fried rice or biryani, but I assume it's similar. And so in jollof, you can change the spice level of a specific thing. So if you are not as tolerant, you can add maybe 1 pepper or 2 or 3, depending on your tolerance or how much your preference is. And so with that, if I wanted to represent chili, I could do so using somewhat of a map function or an iterator. And so in React, what we could do is, in order to hook into the map function, we could take in, let's say prop is a number, or let's say chili is a number. So in order to make that number an array, we could create an empty array, which is what I'm doing at the top in the const. And then with that, I can hook into the map function so that you can iterate through and create the number of chili layers that you would like. And so in Vue, you could do the same. It's a bit different, but it's a similar idea of an iterator. Here we're using a Vue binding, so it's a v-for. And the v-for allows you to, again, iterate through the number of chilies. As you can see below, there's the props and it tells you the type. And so instead of having to create an array, you can directly use that number to iterate through to give you that number. And so the thing with jollof is that you don't always want vegetables. Sometimes you want meat, because it depends, again, on your preference, so if you're vegetarian or not. And so what we want to do is we want to create a meat layer that replaces the vegetable layer. And so what we'll do is we're going to create this prop called vegetarian, and vegetarian is a Boolean. And here in React, because React uses a lot of JavaScript, we can hook into JavaScript functionality. And here we're using a ternary function. And based on whether or not someone is vegetarian or not, we'll return the vegetable layer or the meat layer, which is really handy. And in Vue, again, we're going to use the Vue bindings, because vegetarian is a Boolean. We can directly hook into that using the v-if. So if vegetarian, it will give you vegetables, and if not, it will give you meat. And so if we put all of that logic that we talked about, iterators and if statements, which again is like just part of what Vue offers, we can kind of get a sense of what exactly Vue looks like in a bit more of a complex example, where again, we have the template and then we have the script tags. And what this shows is that ultimately when you're building a Vue app, you can think about your templates separate from your logic. So you can actually concentrate on what you want to render on a page and then add logic to it to update based on specific component, specific data properties and so on. And in Vue, this is a bit different, right? Because again, we're writing our templates right into our JavaScript. And so in a sense, you're thinking about everything all at once. You're thinking about how you want your components to render while also implementing logic, which is a bit different from how Vue implements it. And so with this, I just wanted to jump into a quick demo so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about. This is what I built using that example. And I'm going to move into, move this down here. I'm going to show you the Vue developer tools. And so if you can see, I'm making it super giant. So here we have our single app. And then within it, we have our different layers. So we have our chili layer, our water layer, and so on. And so what we can do with this is, to move everything around. What we can do with this is now I can go into app, and app has different, yeah, so the nice thing is that ultimately what you see is componentization that happens. And so we're going to build on this as we move forward in our talk. So with what we built so far, we have a pot div that contains all the different ingredients that constitute jollof rice. The problem that we have now is that pot is a single element, which means that every time you want to create jollof rice, that jollof will be the exact replica of what you had already created. And this is why I want to talk about rendering children. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that, we have two exact replicas of jollof rice. And from my experience, a lot of preferences and taste buds differ amongst different people. So let's say you want to change between white rice or brown rice and change that layer. Or if you wanted to make Senegalese rice instead of Ghanaian or Nigerian rice. And again, this is a for real, this is like a survey that I built really quickly where you can kind of pick your preferences. And I wanted to just go through and figure out what the audience preferred in terms of the jollof rice. But that's an aside. The other thing you could do is you could switch between the water, the stew layer. So again, you can change the order of the components. And again, this means that the order and the pot itself is different based on the specific preferences of a person. And so in order to do this in React, in order to render the children, what we want to do is we want to remove all of those ingredient layers, and then we'll just do this.props.children, which means now that the pot parent has no concept of what ingredients it will render, which is really handy because now you can change what exactly pot will have in it. And then if you're familiar, what I created earlier, which is this div tag, is ultimately sugar syntax over React.createElement, which takes in 3 elements. It takes in a div, it takes in, as a second argument, style bindings and so on. And the third is any children elements it may have, which we're accessing through this.props.children. And in Vue, lo and behold, we actually have a render function. It's not common practice to use the render function, but because we're writing Vue in a React way before we try to make Vue more Vue-like, let's use the render function. And so what we'll do is the render function, again, has access to that create element property. And so using create element, it works very similar to the way React works. It takes in those 3 arguments, the last being children. But because Vue's implementation is very different from React's, the way you access children is actually not through props. You access children through this.$options _render children. And if this is any indication, or if the underscore is any indication, this is actually not a good practice or not the best way to access children. Another better way of accessing children is through the slots. So you can do this.$slots.default, which gives you access to all child elements within that parent, which is really handy. And if you wanted to take it one step further, you can actually use JSX in Vue using the Babel transform JSX Vue plugin, something along those lines. But it allows you to write JSX, which is really handy because if you have a lot of nested elements and you wanted to write that in the render function, it makes it way easier than having to write create element for every single HTML component. And now I'm going to jump into a demo to show you what that looks like. I'm going to show you. So here, it's ultimately the same thing. Like we have all of the constituent layers. And the thing I wanted to show is in app. It's a bit small, but you can see there's a data layer. And so what I can do is I can change the vegetarian to false or true, and it changes that property based on whatever I want. And then again, you can see that we have a pot element now. Previously, we just had an app, and app contained all the ingredients. But now we have this concept of pot, which means that pot is agnostic of what its children are. So you can put whatever you want within that element, which is really nice. But again, if this is any indication, this is not actually how you write Vue. What we're going to do is we're going to refactor that, and we're going to use the template syntax because that's much more Vue-like. We want to separate our templates from our logic. And so we'll use the slot because that's how you access slots using Vue, which is wonderful. And the other nice thing about slots is you can name the slots, so you can give it specific names. So if you want rice to always be on the bottom because you want your rice to burn and have like crunchy texture, you can do that. You can always say that the slot of rice is on the bottom, and then these are the various layers that go on top. And so even if you were to write something like this, where stew technically is on the bottom and it slots into stew, rice will always be on the bottom regardless of the order that you put here, because we already designated order earlier on in our parent element. Cool. And so this is a nice transition into render props. I'm sure a lot of you who have worked with React are familiar with this. Render props is actually a common practice in React, which is the ability for you to take a function into a component, or pass a function into a component, so that that component knows exactly what to render. The nice thing about render props is it allows you to reuse code while also ensuring that your components look and feel very different from one another. So we're gonna go back to our jollof rice example. But in this case, like all of us are busy developers. We don't like sitting in front or standing in front of a stove, stirring rice and waiting for it to cook. So we use an Instant Pot or something that makes it way faster so we can keep it aside, let it cook on its own without us having to wash the stove. So we want the option of changing the pot element. So it's not always going to be a pot on a stove. It might be an Instant Pot in this case. So what we could do is we could switch out the pot if we wanted to, switch out those elements. But it's really tedious to always tell your jollof rice what container it should be in. So we want there to be a concept of a default. So unless otherwise specified, always cook jollof rice on a stove, because I heard cooking on a stove tastes way better than cooking it in an Instant Pot. And so what we'll do is we'll take all of the code we had earlier, we'll refactor it into a meal component. And then within that meal component, we'll have a slot, and we'll name that slot jollof because this specific dish is called jollof. And then within that slot, what we'll do is we'll put that pot element in it. What this means is that pot is the default of meal. And so the nice thing about slots is slots also allow you to pass down props. So in this case, I have a temperature. I'm hard coding temperature, it's 80 Celsius. And so I can pass that temperature down to pot as necessary, which is really nice. And so if I were to use that specific meal component, which I built over here, I could do this in my app. And then if I wanted to use an Instant Pot, I could use a slot scope or a scope slot, which is denoted by this template syntax and the slot scope within data prop attribute. And then I'll give it the slot of jollof, and then I can pass it that Instant Pot. And I mentioned earlier about how scope slots allow you to pass properties down to child elements. So here in slot scope, we have that temperature that we're grabbing, and then we're passing it through to the Instant Pot through props. So I just wanted to give you an example of what that looks like. Ooh, it's really big. So here we have an example of a pot, an Instant Pot. And then let me pull up this. So what I created here is we have a concept of, I just want you to focus on the screen here. So what we have is this temperature, which is what is being passed down through the parent, and it's decrementing as time goes by. So what I want to do is I want you to like notice the text that is here, which says the pot is hot because the pot is hot. And if I changed it down, so the temperature goes down to maybe 30, the pot's not hot. And so that's really nice because it shows you that the child is able to update its styles based on parent properties that get passed through. The other thing I wanted to show is that if you can see my code, here I have that template slot with the Instant Pot. And so if I were to remove this layer so that it no longer is there, one second. I think I got the wrong code, but it's okay. So ultimately what we have here is that this element gets rendered only because we want that specific thing to show up. So what this means is that because we're passing Instant Pot to meal, this specific thing will show as is. And so now we're going to move to renderless components. And so renderless components is just the ability to render a component that doesn't actually render anything. So that seems like an oxymoron. And I'm going to give you a quick example just so that you know what I'm talking about. So previously, we talked about everything having component layers. So everything has a div within a div and so on. But in this case, what we'll talk about is in the concept of maps. Maps itself is a single element. It renders to canvas. Technically, maps you can use bitmaps and so on, but the way that maps work today to make it more performant is they all render to canvas. So they use WebGL. The problem with this, or it's not really a problem, but the issue with, based on what we talked about so far, is that with Canvas, there is no real concept of componentization because there are no components in Canvas. It's just Canvas. And so that's kind of antithetical to how maps are really, because maps are a series of layers. There is a base layer, which is where the map is. Like the world map, for example, is what I showed you. And then there's the land use part of it. There's the roads part of it, and parks and so on, which gives you extra information and data of what exactly that map is showing and makes a map useful. So I'm going to be using Mapbox.gl, which is an open source library that allows you to implement maps for the web using WebGL. I won't go into detail on how exactly to use Mapbox because their documentation online is quite thorough. But this is quite a quick example of how you would do it. You would just give it an access token, and then you would instantiate new. And then using that now, you have access to the onload function, which allows you to add a source, a layer, events, and so on. So here's a quick showing of how that looks like. This is what Mapbox looks like on the web. It's really, really simple. It allows you to zoom in and look at different parts of the world, which is really nice. And so it's pretty boring right now. We're not actually doing anything, but I'm going to take all of that code that I showed you earlier, and I'm going to throw it into a single component. We'll call this component base map. And then the thing to note about this so far is I'm putting it in a mounted function. Mounted runs on load when a component loads. And then the other thing to note is this reference that I add. And so what reference is doing is it allows me to bind that map component to a specific div, because Mapbox needs you to tell it where exactly it should put the map on the page. So now we have a concept of a base map, which is really nice. But similar to the example that we had of a pot, base map will always be the same every time you replicate the code elsewhere. So anytime you use the base map component, it will always be a world map, which is not always ideal because sometimes you want more than one map showing different places on a page. And so we could, if we wanted to, add props so the map renders differently. But again, the issue is that all of the logic is starting to clump within base map, which starts to be an issue if you have events and so on. And so this is a map that I did quickly of Nigeria. It shows you the constituent states within it and the overall border of Nigeria. And the thing with this is we have a base map and a feature layer. I'll talk about feature events in a bit, but what we want to move towards is something like this, where we have a base map and we have a feature layer and we can have additional layers on top of it. And so that allows you to tease apart that component into separate components so we can move logic and make logic simpler for each component. So in order for base map to know that it has children, we're going to go back to the concept of slot. So we're going to use slot here. And so it expects children. And then now we can move on to implementing feature layer. And so because feature layer isn't actually a real component, it's not actually rendering anything onto a page. In the render function, we'll just return null. And you need to do this because Vue has to render something or at least know what it's rendering. And so this is what we'll do. And then in the mounted function, we can do an add layer, which allows you to add additional layers onto a map. The issue now is because we split the two apart, map is now undefined because the component doesn't actually know what map is. We didn't tell it what map is. So let's go back to the base map. And what we'll do is, earlier we did var map equals new, it instantiates that specific map element. So what we'll do is we'll catch it in a data property, this.map, and then we'll pass that map through to the slot. So we'll call it context, and then we'll pass it to map. And so in order to grab that data property, we'll use slot scope. It grabs the map context and it can pass it down perfectly. And so now we can do whatever we want with map context, which is perfect. But again, we run into an issue. And what is happening is saying invalid prop, map context is null. What is happening is that base map is a parent of feature layer. unfortunately, base map and feature layer are trying to render at the same time because we didn't tell feature layer to wait until parent renders because it automatically is like, okay, let me render. And so what we'll do is we'll create this loaded property. And so only when the map is loaded, it will move it to true. And then we can pass that loaded property to the slot. And then the slot, we can use the v-if binding. So if it's loaded, then render children. And so now we have a perfect map, which works. And so the map that we had was great, but we wanted to add more to it. So this allows you to hover, and it gives you the ability to click and so on. So we have events that get added onto the map. So I want a feature event that is a child of feature layer. And so what we'll do is now feature layer has a child. And so now we have to go back to feature layer. We have to refactor it to expect a slot. So the reason I'm doing a render function here is because I don't want any div to be rendered. If you use a template in Vue, the template syntax does not allow you to use slot as a root element. And as a result, I'm using a render function here so that slot is a root element. And so with that, I will use the dependency injection in Vue. So there's a provide inject. And so I can provide map context and then inject that map context into feature event. This is nice because now you don't have to pass the props through. So if you have a lot of nested children, it's very handy. So with that, now I can use the map context to do a lot of interesting things like a mouse enter, a mouse leave, and so on. So just a quick demo of what that is like. We have our map here. And then we can like hover over everything, which is really nice. I'm gonna show you this other one. So everything works, and then within our base map, we have all of our layers. It does not work for everything. And so that's like pretty much all of the layers that we have. It's really hard to do it. Anyway, you get the idea. And so what we talked about so far is the concept of render components, render children, render props, and renderless components. And the nice thing is that these concepts actually translate very easily from React to Vue. The only difference is that maybe a couple of the vocabulary is different. So we don't really say render props in Vue. We say scope slots, which is a bit different, but slightly similar, and the concepts still carry over. And hopefully this talk gives you a concept of how to move your thinking from React to Vue. And with that, I hope you guys have a good day. And here are the links to my slides, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, dear. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you for the teaching. So I would like to know, the render props is currently being used in libraries like React Downstream and one other one anyway. So can we make use of it in other libraries like Apollo and Node.js?
How do you use, so the question is, how do you use a concept like render props?
Render props in other libraries, yes, in other libraries. Better put, how do we use render props in other libraries like Apollo?
That's a really good question. I think, so my understanding is if you wanted to use render props specifically in Vue using Apollo, my understanding is you have to do a lot of that translation yourself. So you would have to create those components and then hook into Apollo, because I think in order to use Apollo with Vue, I don't believe you can use render props by default. So you might have to figure it out on your own, if that answers your question.
So if you're using Apollo, you have the Vue Apollo plugin, and you can actually use render props with Apollo. Yeah.
In React or in Vue?
In Vue.
In Vue? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know. I assumed I had to do it myself, and I have done that before, but okay.
So initially, all the components in Apollo was using, you could use the higher order components, but then for the new API of Apollo, you can use render props easily. Yeah, so it works fine, very fine.
Cool.
Any other questions? I can show you some examples of render props too. With Apollo though.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was amazing. React really is my first love. I came from a very artsy background, but I fell in love with React and entered into all of it. All right, so my question really is, what does Vue do better than React? I guess I'm very biased, heavily biased to React. Everyone that knows me knows that. So what does Vue do better than React that made you switch?
That's a really good question. I get that a lot. So I think it's based on your preference, right? So I used to do a lot of React. I loved React. I think it's still a great community, a great framework. The thing that I love about Vue is just the ability to separate my logic from my templates. And that's a huge thing for me because sometimes when I write JSX, I find it just like the cognitive load of having to write my JavaScript and my templates at the same time is really confusing. And so I like the ability to choose to use the render function when I want to use it, and then not most of the time. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer Vue over React. The other thing is I like the reactivity system. I didn't talk about that a lot in this specific talk, but Vue has a really great reactivity and update system. And so I think in React, you would do like this.setState and so on. But in Vue, it automatically, every time you define a data property, it is automatically reactive, which is really nice. So reactivity out of the box is another reason I really like it. And then third is I really like the Vue community. It's really young. It's a bit younger than React is. And so it has the benefit of being smaller and more tight-knit. And so if you're a Vue developer who's getting started, there's a lot of resources and you have access to a lot of the Vue core members and so on, which I really enjoy and I like. So again, like you're biased towards React, I'm biased towards Vue, but again, it's a preference thing when it comes down to it. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, dear. Okay, so